Hello and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. I'm Joan Kjaer, and WorldCanvass is coming to you from the Senate Chamber of the Old Capitol Museum on the campus of the University of Iowa. Very happy to have you all with us. This program is part 3 of a 4-part series on the rise of public opinion in China. We're investigating the influence of public opinion on political reform, political trust, foreign policy, and public discourse. Earlier segments of the series have addressed political reform and political trust. Tonight, we're going to look at the interplay between public opinion and foreign policy. We have an expert panel of guests to shed light on this very interesting topic, and they are next to me here. Peter Gries, Professor of International and Area Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Thank you, Peter, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, pleasure. Next to him, Brian Lai. Hi, Brian.
Hi.
Brian is an Associate Professor of Political Science here at the University of Iowa. And at the far end, we have Ming Zhang, Associate Professor of Political Science at the California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you know, Brian, I think I'll start with you. We've done these talks before, and so I think I'll throw the first question, which is just very, very basic, but how does public opinion affect foreign policy in China?
Well, that's a good question, because actually in our scholarship we get that a lot. People talk about, since China is not a democracy, does public opinion really have an impact? And it does. I think in a lot of the earlier segments that hopefully people have watched previously, I mean, in one way, I mean, we know the Chinese government does take these internal polls to get a sense of what people are thinking, and that influences sort of Chinese decision making. In another sense, I mean, in a broader sense, Chinese public opinion sort of provides a base level for the government to think about. In some ways, it serves as two functions. One is it can help the government mobilize support in some senses, but they also have to be careful in terms of a sort of an over-mobilization that can sort of make their own decisions or actions with other governments difficult. So we saw this example in sort of anti-Japanese rallies that occurred in which the Chinese government sort of, in some senses, it produced nationalism for China, but also created a danger of creating too much anti-Japanese sentiment given China's commercial relations with Japan.
I think I'd add that it is indeed, I agree with Brian very much, that I think the natural tendency for an American is to see Chinese public opinion as a contradiction in terms, because Chinese don't vote. And I think we assume that the reason why politicians pay attention to public opinion is because they're worried about being booted out of office. That's not the concern in China. Instead, the argument that I make is that the reason why the Chinese government cares about nationalist opinion is because the Chinese Communist Party has staked its claim to legitimacy, to the right to rule China, ever since 1949, in large part on a nationalist claim. Mao Zedong is widely remembered in China on the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, not for getting up and saying, "Workers of the world unite," or some communist slogan. What he's remembered for is saying, "China has stood up." And what he's referring to is China standing up against the forces of Western and Japanese imperialism that were seen to have oppressed and exploited China for a century. And so the Chinese Communist Party, ironically, has been staking its claim to legitimacy, its claim to a right to rule on the basis of nationalism for 60 years now or more. And as a result, the government has to be responsive on this issue because it's its own issue. Yeah. And so the people can speak back using the language of nationalism. So that's why the state plays, the Communist Party pays a lot of attention to popular nationalist opinion, in my opinion.
Well, I agree with both of my colleagues here. I think we need to really disaggregate the concept of nationalism. I just did a recent study of online comments on China-Japan relations that have been posted in 2012 and 2013. And a lot of those comments were prompted by the recent territorial disputes on the Diaoyu Islands. Now, when we analyze the claims that these people make, the points they try to make, if you read New York Times, you would think, everybody wants to challenge Japan and so forth and so on. Actually, a larger number of the points that are made by these people are actually saying, well, our government is not dealing with this well enough. So I think this nationalistic reaction in some sense a larger result of China, of the self sort of reflective understanding and view of the Chinese themselves, you know. And with the inflow of information and you know, internet, television, and a more and more open communication system worldwide, the Chinese public is becoming more and more actively engaged in assessing their own position in the world. Yeah. So it really truly is a multifaceted phenomenon. Mm-hmm.
Second down and 2, Bodell. In motion. Green has the first down. Makes a mark. 20. Spins.
God! 5-yard line. Goal line. Touchdown, Iowa. You will never see a prettier run than that.
In terms of television, for example, in China, mass television, and I know there are many, many channels, are there a lot of talking head shows, a lot of talk shows about the news, people presenting various sides as we have on cable news channels here? Is that kind of polemic on TV all the time for people to pay attention to?
Why are you both out looking at me? You know, yeah, I think we can probably all comment on this. My recent visits during my recent visits to China, I did notice many of the TV shows, and both in politics and social affairs and cultural affairs and entertainment, you know, dating shows, and a lot of the formats and contents and so forth and so on of those shows, you know, are sort of following the model of the American television. So a lot of the times you do see different you know, viewpoints being presented to each other, you know, different people with different ideas brought together at the same table and argue with each other. You know, I remember watching this debate really when the Copenhagen summit meeting was on. I think it was at the end of 2009. Somewhere there, and you know, the debate I watched was really heated, and it was very eye-opening even to me, you know, to sort of how openly and actively people can just go out and challenge each other, because, you know, the Chinese culture mandates that we be humble and, you know, deferential and polite, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the popular television programs really have changed the debate culture, the ways that people talk about politics, the way that people discuss politics, and the development of new political discourses to a substantial extent.
Mm-hmm. But I think I agree with that, and I would sort of further point to actually your research, Ning, that shows that one of the more important locations for this kind of discourse is actually online. It's on the internet. So television, there are occasionally elites who talk about foreign policy, and there are all the entertainment programs that I agree with you generate a culture that's more perhaps opinionated, right? But the space in which you hear the most about foreign policy, and especially the space in which nationalist opinion, you know, whether it's anti-Japanese or anti-American or whatever the context is usually the internet. And it really is just an incredibly democratic space, actually. When it comes to nationalism, there's a lot of freedom. And the government is in a kind of cat and mouse game to a certain extent in terms of censoring some of those sentiments. And I know you'll be talking about that next week when you discuss social media issues.
Yes, yes.
Show your Iowa pride, the Iowa Hawk Shop, where Iowa shops. The ultimate collection of Iowa Hawkeye merchandise, gifts, and apparel. Help support the University of Iowa. All proceeds benefit men's and women's athletic teams and student programs. The Iowa Hawk Shop, where Iowa shops. Show your Iowa pride. Call 1-800-HAWK-SHOP or visit www.hawkshop.com.
So we've heard a little bit about this dispute with Japan, and we've mentioned foreign policy perhaps related to the US, but when you think of something like Syria, what's happening in Syria, and you listen to American political debates about what should be done, of course there are lots of different opinions, but we come to the UN, and China is at present anyway, not in the same position that the US is in terms of some of its feelings about this current problem in the Middle East. Do Chinese people talk about, in social media spaces, are they talking about what should happen with Syria? Are the Chinese people engaged in some of these other regional disputes around the world?
I personally think we're all pretty narcissistic. So we think about our own countries, and we tend to interpret the behaviors of other countries in terms of our own frameworks. So my guess is most Chinese are not paying too much attention, but when they do look at it, they'll see it through the framework of the way they understand their past encounter with Western imperialism. So they'll believe that, they'll tend to believe that America is just butting its self into the Middle East, or perhaps even trying to prevent China from having access to the oil and other energy resources that it needs to develop. So there'll be a natural tendency to sort of view it through the prism of the self.
I'd like to add that I think in terms, to answer your question, I think there is a difference between the Americans' worldview and the Chinese worldview. America is the hegemonic power, there's no question about that, and the US has been playing this clearly leadership role in international affairs for decades, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, during these decades, I think the American intellectuals, liberals, and the public have acquired this taste to know everything. They think, in some ways, sometimes I feel it is in their right to know, and they should know. They have this obligation to know. While we talk about the rise of China, China is not there yet. So I haven't done research on that. So, but my sort of impression is that I agree with Peter that the Chinese public would be much more sort of tuned in to those international affairs that directly impact them than something that from a different perspective we may think may be related to them, but it's not really directly tied into their everyday life.
Sure, I agree with Peter in the sense that I think when they do think about things outside of their daily lives, outside of disputes in their region, I think they sort of use a frame that's comfortable that comes to mind, and that is this idea of sort of what is America's role in all of this? And so I think this sense of China itself not getting sort of the national respect it deserves, as well as sort of the idea of sort of the U.S. trying to maintain its hegemony over the world, sort of as a frame it uses when it thinks about policies like Syria, and it sort of sees the U.S. thinking about intervention, it thinks about sort of the U.S. intervening in Iraq and other countries. And so I think that's the type of frame that gets used when they don't have a lot of proximate information about that type of issue.
A couple of years ago, Brian, you and Wenfang were on another discussion like this, and the question you were both debating, you each took a different side of the argument for the sake of argument, and the question was, is China a threat, looking from the U.S. perspective? Now, in our earlier program, Wenfang Tang mentioned this polling in China where what's the greatest threat to China, and Chinese response would be overwhelmingly the U.S. Are the U.S. and China in that sort of threat relationship with one another, in your view? Is it in the hands of the U.S. to stop China from becoming what it wants to become, or vice versa?
So I will say the U.S. government is very concerned about Chinese public opinion about the U.S. I mean, there's numerous congressional hearings and efforts by the U.S. to engage in broader public diplomacy with China. In fact, there's a lot of concern about from the U.S.'s side about China not letting the U.S. engage in public diplomacy as much as it would, including setting up, so in Iowa City we have Confucius Center. In China, there are only 5 American centers limited by the Chinese government. And so it is a concern. I mean, the U.S. government is concerned about being perceived in a negative light by the Chinese public. And as some of my other colleagues can talk about, I mean, you do see that in surveys, that there's variation by characteristics of the individual, but in general, there is some concern about threat from the United States.
This is actually, to me, one of the more maybe almost humorous aspects of commonality in U.S.-China relations, because Americans are always shocked to hear that Chinese might find American behaviors threatening, and yet Chinese are also shocked when they find that other nations find China's behavior threatening. It's just a natural social psychological tendency that we believe the groups to which we identify are benign, and that if others are interpreting it otherwise, it's because they have malign intentions. To me, it's just natural. I mean, these are the 2 biggest players in terms of states in the 21st century, and we are inherently threatening. And yet we are so blind to that. In fact, we are purposefully blind to that, willfully blind to that.
Yeah.
I'd like to add to that. My colleagues here have mentioned a couple of times already of the concept of mental framework that people use to think about themselves and their country and so forth and so on. And everybody does that, right? So I think as scholars, our research can shed light on why do people think of the U.S., let's say, in certain ways, and why do the Chinese see themselves in certain ways? And just very briefly, in my research, I found that let's imagine an abstract Chinese mind, right? And there's 2 kinds of sources, input we can actually tune. So one kind of source is, things that are happening, news, facts, blah, blah, blah. And the other source of the input to this mind is Chinese collective memory, its recent history, this psychological burden of overcoming and coming out of this 100 years of humiliation and so forth and so on. So what I found is when the Chinese look outside into the world, let's say what the US is doing, what Japan is doing, they tune up the information tuner. So they use more facts, more news items and so forth and so on to inform themselves. But when they think about how well they're doing, their country is doing, their government is doing, they are doing as a people to deal with all this, they tune up the they tune up the collective memory, the historical frame, and so forth and so on. So nobody can escape history, right? And we are all products of our time and where we are and part of our world. So I think it's While some of us may understand the rise of Chinese nationalism as a product of China's increase of China's hard power and soft power over the world, I sort of see that as sort of really an outcome of this critical assessment based on their memory of their recent past.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have a 3D card.
Why are you taking it, Tijan?
So the key thing here is that
Well, looking at the transition over these last, I guess, 20 years or so, perhaps a little more than that, into a very sort of market-based and economy and, incredible economic engine and so on. So much improvement in the daily lives of many people in China. You can see that would, one's national pride might lift tremendously there. I think in the U.S. there's still many people my age and older who live with a label communist China. It kind of doesn't ever go away if that's what you lived with. Within the older generation in China, what kind of reflection is there to their communist past and to are we better off now than we were then? Peter.
I think that's a very astute observation. And in fact, the public opinion surveys that I've done in China and the US support that. Older Americans are more likely to view China in a more negative light. And I don't have any doubt that if I explored that further, it would be because of the Cold War legacy. And older Chinese also, I think, because of the Cold War, tend to have a more negative view of the outside world in general and the U.S. in particular. And again, it's a legacy of the Cold War. Let's not forget that the Korean War was not that long ago, and we were in direct conflict. And while the Korean War is the forgotten war in the United States, it is absolutely central to Chinese national identity today. If you talk to a mainland Chinese person, they will be unequivocal that China won the Korean War. Yet I think if you spoke to most Americans, they would say, well, it kind of ended up where it started, and at least we saved the South Koreans from being driven off the Korean Peninsula. So they're very different views of the war, but the war means much more for Chinese today than it does for Americans.
Well, I'll come back to you, Brian. What do you see as the biggest the most dominant foreign policy kinds of issues that the public is currently thinking about, talking about in China?
So, I mean, in China, I think there are, again, like local issues are always very important. In terms of foreign policy, I mean, I think this idea of, it's both, as everyone's talked about, this idea of China's role in the world. I mean, China's, grown tremendously economically, as many people know. Its place in the world, its role of its currency in particular, has been central in Asia. And so I think, this sort of frame of their role in the world is becoming important, and particularly how that relates to other Asian countries and relative to the United States. I think those are two very important themes that are prominent in the minds of most Chinese.
And prominent now in the minds of Americans too, with this debt issue we have now. Many people are becoming aware that if China were to say, you know what, we're not so interested in lending to you, this could be an issue for the United States. We have ties in other parts of the world that sometimes I think, at least on an average citizen's level, we don't really understand who helps to support the economy that we have here, and some necessary compromises sometimes.
I'm not a political economist, but I do think that there's fairly widespread misunderstanding in the United States about the implications of the economic interdependence between China and the United States. I think the thought is that we owe them money and therefore they have leverage over us. And if we only owed them $10 or $50, that would be true. But we owe them a lot more than that. Yeah. So in many ways, the leverage is completely opposite. We hold all the levers. If you think about the fact that they hold so many treasury bills, and yet we're the ones who make decisions about the value of the US dollar, you know, the Chinese are helpless to essentially maintain the value of their reserves. So I like to talk about it as the economic relationship is so interdependent that it's mutually assured economic destruction. And so it's actually a stabilizing force overall in terms of the actual workings. Now, it may be destabilizing in terms of generating fear, which I think is based on misunderstanding. There's, especially in America, a lot of worry about the debt and the implications that has, and maybe contributes to feelings that China threatens America. I think they're misplaced, and I think actually the economic interdependence should be a source of stability in the relationship.
Well, again, yeah, I agree. On the other hand, I think from my point of view, you know, as a Chinese who lives in America, it seems to me as though the financial responsibilities, you know, that the American government carries for those debts are used as leverages for domestic politics. I mean, the government was on the fringe of default on all their debts to everybody for how long? For about a month or so, half a month or so, and then at the same time, the Americans were not very happy that the Chinese president or prime minister, or I think actually the foreign minister, sort of, you know, scolded America for, you know, please take up your financial responsibility and so forth and so on. So I don't know. I think I quite agree with you, Peter, that these economies are so intertwined that therefore these arguments really are most valid on the rhetoric level. I don't think they're as meaningful. Well, I'm not a political economist either, as they may sound.
Well, I think we've come to the end of the time we have, but I'm so grateful you could all join us. Peter Gries, Brian Lai, and Ning Zhang, thank you. You've been listening to the third installment of a four-part series called The Rise of Public Opinion in China. The full series and all WorldCanvass programming can be found on the Hawkeye Network, on iTunes, KRUI, and on the International Programs website, which is international.uiowa.edu. So thank you for being with us for tonight's program, and join us next week when we'll be discussing public opinion and social media in China. For UI International Programs, the Hawkeye Network, the Pentecost Museums, and KRUI, I'm Joan Kjaer. See you next time. Good night.